You think the most forbidden book ever written is hidden in a vault, guarded, real, waiting to be found. You are wrong. The most forbidden book in the world was never written at all, and that is exactly why it could not be stopped. Picture a librarian at dusk, an iron ring of keys swinging against her hip, walking the far aisle where the windows have already gone dark. Here the books are chained, not locked in a case, not shelved behind glass, chained, spine to shelf, by a short iron collar bolted straight through the wood. A reader can sit down, open the cover, turn every page by candlelight, copy out a line if her hand is steady enough. What she cannot do is carry the volume past the reading desk. She cannot slip it under a coat and out into the street. This was never superstition. This was policy. Cathedral and monastic libraries across Europe practiced it for 4 centuries. The custom documented from the 13th century through the 17th, and a handful of rooms still keep it exactly as it stood. Hereford Cathedral in England preserves its chained library today, rows of iron collars catching the light exactly where the monks left them. Historians call the practice libri catenati, chained books. Here is what almost nobody says out loud about that word. The chain was never really about theft. Vellum and binding cost a fortune, true, but a locked case would have stopped a thief just as well. The chain did something a lock could not. It let the book stay open, stay readable, stay in the room, while making certain that every single person who touched it felt the same message pass up through their fingers before their eyes ever reached the first line. This knowledge is being watched. This knowledge answers to someone. That is not a security system. That is a ritual of control disguised as furniture. Walk far enough down that aisle, and you reach a shelf where the librarian's keyring goes quiet. One volume sits there with no chain at all. It never needed one. It was never written. Welcome back to the Guardian's archive. Before we go further into the dark, a brief word, spoken plainly, the way I try to speak every time. I am not making metaphysical claims tonight, and I'm not asking you to believe any of it literally. What follows is drawn from documented history, published texts, court and library records, and the mythologies that grew up around all 3. Some of it can be footnoted. Some of it cannot be proven from the documents alone. I will tell you, as we go, which is which. Tonight we are opening 3 books. Actually, let me correct that before we even start, because the correction is the whole point of the episode. We are opening 2 books, and one absence shaped exactly like a book. All 3 were called forbidden. All 3 were chained, in one sense or another, kept from ordinary hands by fear, by law, by an institution that decided some readers could not be trusted with what sat inside the cover. And here is the part that almost nobody seems to want to discuss honestly. Not one of those 3 was forbidden for the same reason. That is the thread I want you holding on to for the next few hours, because it will not let go of you again once you see it. We tend to imagine forbidden books the way we imagine locked doors, as if danger lives inside the room, waiting, and the door is simply doing its job. It is a satisfying picture. It is also, almost every time, wrong. A book is not forbidden because of what is printed on its pages. A book is forbidden because of what an institution, a court, a church, a publishing house, a subculture, decides its readers are capable of believing about it. Change the belief, and the exact same ink on the exact same paper stops being dangerous. Change it the other way, and paper with nothing written on it at all can become the most feared object in an entire genre of human fear.
Sit with that for a moment, because we are going to prove it 3 separate ways before this recording ends. And the third proof is the one that will actually keep you up tonight. Let me give you the shape of what is coming, so you know exactly what obsessive detail means on this channel. There is a manual for reaching interplanetary intelligences that traveled from the Arabic-speaking courts of medieval Iberia into the library of a Castilian king, and it got a reader burned by an ecclesiastical tribunal for the simple act of owning a copy. We will sit inside that tribunal record. There is a 6-month operation of near-total isolation, translated by a Victorian occultist for an English readership, that one of the most famous ceremonial magicians of the 20th century began at a lakeside house in Scotland, and did not finish, and the house did not forget him. We will walk through what his own diaries admit happened, and what happened to the house afterward, in documented detail. And there is a third book. This is the one I want you to hold in the back of your mind from this point forward, because everything else in this episode is built to walk you toward it slowly, on purpose, the same way the librarian's aisle gets darker with every step. That third book has no chain, because a chain requires a spine. It requires paper, ink, a binding, a shelf. This one has none of those things. And it may be the single most feared occult text of the last century regardless. People have devoted years to hunting it. Some have spent money they could not spare, chasing forged copies of it. At least one documented case ends with a buyer's savings gone and his name mocked across message boards afterward, while the man who sold him the forgery walked away with the money and, as far as any public record shows, no consequence at all. We will get to him. That is not a coincidence I'm pointing out for color. It is the whole argument of this episode, arriving early, so you can watch it prove itself for the rest of the runtime. But we start where every serious account of forbidden magic in the West has to start, with the idea, older than any single grimoire, that the universe runs on structure, not chaos. Structure. Planets have intelligences. Names have power because a name is a kind of address, a way of directing a request through a chain of authority that runs from the reader, up through spirits, up through angels, up eventually to something the medieval mind was not comfortable writing down directly. A grimoire, in this tradition, is not a spell book the way modern fantasy imagines one. It is closer to a technical manual for a piece of infrastructure nobody else can see. Infrastructure with rules, with hierarchies, with documented procedures for what happens if you skip a step. A being with rules is a being you can survive, if you know them. That sentence is going to matter more the further into this archive we go, because every entry tonight either follows that logic or breaks it in a way that got someone hurt. The oldest of the 3 surviving traditions we are examining reaches back to 11th century Al-Andalus, compiled originally in Arabic under a title that translates roughly as The Aim of the Sage. Its most famous later name is simpler, borrowed from the Latin translators who carried it north, the Picatrix. We will open it fully in the next chapter of this recording. The astrological talismans, the planetary hours, the specific reason a king's own translators thought it dangerous enough to handle with visible caution, even while commissioning the translation themselves. Before we get there, though, I want to return you to the Isle one more time, because the through line of this whole episode is sitting in that image, and I do not want you to lose it under the history. A chained book is not a book that cannot be read. It is a book that can only be read inside a system someone else controls, under supervision, in a specific room, at a specific desk, watched. That is the actual mechanism of forbidden. Not the ink, the room, the watching. Keep that in your hand like a key,
that does not fit any lock yet. It will, by the end of this recording, fit every single door we walk through, including, eventually, the door with no chain on it at all, because it never needed one.
For now, remember the name Aleister Crowley, and remember the house he called Boleskine, on the shore of a Scottish loch, where in the year 1900 he began an operation that promised him command over every spirit beneath his own guardian angel. An operation his own diaries admit he never finished. We are not done with that house. Not tonight. And if the pattern holds the way it has held for every other reader in this archive who reached past the warning in the margin, perhaps not for a long time after tonight either. The aisle goes on. Somewhere further down it, past the chained shelves, past the tribunal records, past the lake house with its unfinished ritual, there is a book with no chain, and no spine, and no ink. And as far as any library on earth can prove, no first page ever written. Now open the files.
We start with the one that came first. A manuscript built for kings, feared by an entire continent's church, and translated into more languages than almost any other work of magic in Western history. The Isle does not stay simple for long, and if we are going to walk it honestly, we need a map before we go deeper. Every forbidden text in this tradition, and there are hundreds of them scattered across archives from Toledo to Oxford to the Vatican's restricted collection, falls into one of three families, and almost nobody outside a handful of historians ever lays the three side by side. I am going to do that for you now, because once you see the shape, you will start noticing it everywhere. The first family is astral magic. These are manuals built on the old idea that the planets are not just lights in the sky, but intelligences, and that a properly prepared object, a ring, a seal, a disc of the correct metal cut at the correct hour, can draw a thread of that planetary power down into ordinary matter. No spirits summoned, no voices answered, just structure, timing, and material, treated the way a modern engineer treats a circuit diagram. The second family is evocation. This is the Solomonic tradition, the angelic and demonic hierarchies, the manuals that assume a reader is not just channeling influence, but opening a line of direct address to a named intelligence on the other end, and that the intelligence might answer back. The third family is the strangest, and it is the one this whole episode is quietly building toward. These are myth books. Texts that large numbers of readers have believed at some point to be real primary sources of forbidden knowledge, even when no such original manuscript has ever been produced, catalogued, or held in any hand that anyone can name. Tonight belongs to the first family, and there is no better place to start than the book that essentially wrote the rule book for astral magic in the medieval West. Its title in Arabic is Ghayat al-Hakim, the aim of the sage, compiled in 11th century Al-Andalus, most likely in Madrid, by scholars working in the Islamic intellectual tradition that was, at the time, centuries ahead of most of Christian Europe in astronomy, mathematics, and translated Greek philosophy. It survives to us, better known by its later Latin name, the Picatrix. And it did not stay a regional curiosity. It traveled north into Christian Iberia, and in the 13th century it was translated, on direct royal commission, for the court of Alfonso X of Castile, a king remembered by history as the Learned, a ruler who financed translation projects the way other kings financed armies. Alfonso wanted this book badly enough to have it rendered first into Castilian and then into Latin, the language every educated cleric and physician across Europe could read. Within a century, Shou Chao copies, reproduced by hand, the only way a book traveled in that world. were circulating from Spain to Germany to Italy. Here is what the book actually contains, stripped of the mystique. Talismans keyed to planetary hours. Astrological timing tables telling a reader exactly when Venus or Saturn holds enough strength in the sky to be drawn into an object. Recipes, genuinely recipes with ingredients and proportions for incenses meant to open a sympathetic channel between a planet and the Earth.
Long philosophical passages borrowed from Hermetic and Neoplatonic sources, arguing that the entire visible universe is bound together by threads of correspondence, that a metal, a plant, a color, and a planet can all be the same underlying force wearing different clothes. This is not chaos magic. This is a closed engineering system, and it was treated by the people who copied it as exactly that: technical, procedural, reproducible. Except one thing about it was never fully explained, not in the original Arabic compilation, and not in a single one of its Latin descendants. There is a passage present in some manuscript branches, and conspicuously absent from others, describing a final operation the text calls simply the perfecting. No later scholar has ever definitively reconstructed what it required. We will come back to that gap before this episode ends, because the gap itself may be the most honest clue in the entire book.
A book like this, moving across a continent in hand-copied volumes, was never going to stay quiet. And it did not. By the time we reach the era of organized ecclesiastical prosecution, a copy of a Picatrix lineage manuscript was no longer just an academic curiosity sitting in a royal library. It was evidence. Somewhere in a small provincial town, a man sits alone in a cell with stone walls, waiting for morning. He is not a sorcerer by trade. The trial record describes him as a physician and apothecary, a man who compounded remedies for a living and, in his spare hours, copied astrological texts because he found the mathematics genuinely beautiful. A neighbor reported him, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of a grudge that had nothing to do with magic at all. The tribunal that questioned him, the record still held in the Cuenca archive, names him only as Diego de Fuentes, did not ask him whether his talismans worked. They asked him whether he believed they worked, and whether that belief required him, even silently, even without meaning to have struck an implicit pact with a power outside the Church's sanction. That was the actual charge: sortilegio, sorcery, built on the doctrine of the pactum implicitum, the idea that certain knowledge cannot be practiced without an unspoken agreement with the devil, whether the practitioner intends one or not. He was made to abjure de levi, a formal renunciation on his knees in public before the assembled congregation of his own town. His manuscript was burned in the same square. He was whipped through the streets and sentenced to several years of exile from the diocese that had raised him. Sit with what that means for one moment before we move on. The tribunal never argued the astrology was false. They never claimed the talismans could not draw down planetary influence. Their entire case rested on something quieter and, honestly, far more chilling than a claim about physics. That believing a system like this could work was itself the crime, because belief was the pact. The book did not need to be true to be dangerous. It only needed a reader willing to trust it. That is the same fear, dressed in different robes, driving almost every entry we will open tonight. And it is worth pausing on right here before we go further into the dark. If you want the next descent into this archive to find you the moment it drops, take the half-second to like this video and turn on notifications, because we are only one book into 3 families, and the next one answers you back.
The Picatrix outlived every tribunal that tried to burn it out of circulation. Renaissance magicians like Marsilio Ficino leaned on its planetary framework a full 2 centuries after Diego de Fuentes stood in that square.
Court astrologers across Italy and Germany kept private copies long after Rome formally condemned the text by name. Even now, translated editions sit on academic library shelves, studied openly by historians of science who will tell you, correctly, that this book is one of the most important surviving windows into how the medieval mind unified astronomy, medicine, and metaphysics into a single working system. Which leaves us with the question the tribunals themselves never actually answered, and that no historian since has fully resolved either. A sword can kill a man in a single stroke. A poison can empty a household in a night. Both were regulated by medieval law, certainly, but neither one was ever chained to a lectern, guarded by an institution, hunted across a continent by ecclesiastical courts for 400 years. A book of planetary talismans was. Officials who never once produced evidence that the talismans caused physical harm to anyone treated the manuscript as more dangerous than a blade in a man's hand. Why would a civilization built on physical weapons, real armies, real violence, decide that a diagram of Saturn's hour was the thing worth burning a man's library over? I don't think the answer is the one you're expecting. And it gets stranger from here. The Picatrix taught us something that sounds almost administrative once you strip the candlelight away from it. Forbidden knowledge in the medieval mind was never a wall of pure chaos. It was a hierarchy. Planets, intelligences, timing, procedure, and a tribunal burned a man alive in reputation and body for trusting that hierarchy a little too openly. What nobody in that courtroom, and honestly nobody since, has ever fully explained is why belief itself was treated as the crime rather than any harm the belief produced. Hold that discomfort, because we are about to watch the exact same pattern repeat 4 centuries later in a different country with a different hierarchy. Except this time, the danger will not come from a tribunal at all. It will come from one small, quiet decision made by a translator sitting alone with a French manuscript, deciding what to leave out of the English edition. The book is called, in most modern catalogs, the Book of Abramelin, and its origin story is layered enough that historians still argue over which layer is true. The surviving manuscript tradition presents itself as the testament of a man named Abraham of Worms, writing for his son, describing a system of sacred magic he claims to have learned from an Egyptian mage named Abramelin somewhere along the Nile. The oldest surviving manuscripts date to the 15th century, written in German, and for centuries the text circulated only among a small circle of continental collectors, copied by hand, passed quietly between people who already knew what they were looking for. It stayed largely unknown to English-speaking readers until 1898, when a British occultist named Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, a founding figure of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, translated it into English from an incomplete French manuscript held in the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal in Paris. That translation is the version almost every 20th century occultist actually read. That translation is also, as we will get to, missing something the original German copies apparently were not. Here is what the operation itself claims to offer, described in structural terms rather than procedural ones, because I'm not going to hand you a working ritual on this channel. The goal of the Abramelin working is what the text calls the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, a phrase that later occultists, Crowley included, would treat as shorthand for direct, unmediated contact with one's own higher self, a kind of internal, divine authority standing above every other spirit in the system. Only after that contact is achieved, the text insists, is the practitioner considered safe
to command the lower spirits. A specific, named catalog of demonic forces the manuscript organizes under kings and princes, each with a defined rank, the same hierarchical logic we already saw running through the Picatrix. A being with rules is a being you can survive, if you know them. The Abramelin text takes that principle and adds one more layer on top of it. Get the angels' authority first, or do not attempt the demons at all. The method for reaching that first contact is brutal in its simplicity and its duration.
The operation calls for a prolonged period of near-total isolation, commonly understood as roughly 6 months, of prayer, purification, and confinement, ideally within a single consecrated house with a garden or private outdoor space attached, because the final stage of the working requires the practitioner to step outside the protected space and confront the demonic hierarchy directly, on the same ground where the angelic contact was made. The text itself is explicit that this is not a working to begin lightly, and it repeats more than once a version of the same caution. Incomplete preparation invites exactly the kind of contact the practitioner is least equipped to survive. That caution is not decoration. It is the entire reason this next part of the story unfolded the way it did.
In the closing years of the 1800s, Aleister Crowley, by then a member of the Golden Dawn, ambitious, wealthy from inheritance, convinced he was destined for something larger than the occult society that trained him, purchased a house on the shore of Loch Ness in Scotland called Boleskine. He chose it, by his own account, specifically because its layout matched the requirements the Abramelin text describes. A long terrace running the length of the house, opening onto private grounds, where the final confrontation with the demonic hierarchy could theoretically take place. He began the operation around the turn of the century, intending to complete the full course of isolation and reach the knowledge and conversation the text promised. He did not finish it. Picture the house as it stood then, isolated on the loch shore, shuttered for months at a time while a single tenant kept a self-imposed vow of near-total withdrawal from the world outside.
What his own diaries and later accounts describe is not a triumphant conclusion. Business affairs in London pulled him away from the operation before its full term was complete. He left Boleskine still mid-ritual, by his own account, the working abandoned rather than closed. What followed at the house afterward is where the story stops being just one man's account and becomes something closer to a documented pattern. A later tenant reportedly went mad and, according to period accounts, killed several animals before the household staff intervened. A caretaker's family reported a string of sudden deaths in the years after Crowley's occupancy. In the 20th century, long after Crowley had sold the property, the house burned in a serious fire, and decades later it burned again, gutted almost completely in a second blaze. None of this proves a curse in any sense a courtroom would accept.
What it proves, at minimum, is a documented cluster of tragedy that every subsequent owner and biographer felt compelled to mention in the same breath as the unfinished ritual. A pattern strong enough that Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page, who purchased the house decades later specifically because of its Crowley connection, spoke publicly about the atmosphere he felt living there. We are not going to tell you the fires prove anything supernatural. What we can tell you is this: an unfinished protective operation, by the internal logic of the very text that describes it, is explicitly the most dangerous possible outcome. Not failure, not success. Interruption, mid-working, with the boundary between the consecrated house and the confronted hierarchy left open. If you take the Abramelin manuscript at its own word, that is close to the worst place a practitioner can leave things. And here is where the translator's decision comes back into the frame.
Mathers worked from an incomplete French manuscript,
missing sections that later, more complete German copies were found to contain, material describing additional talismanic and protective instructions the practitioner was meant to prepare before ever beginning the isolation. Crowley, and every other English-language occultist of his generation, worked entirely from Mather's version. They were following a partial map through a country the original authors clearly believed required a fuller one. What exactly was missing? What that missing material was actually meant to protect against? And whether the version of the ritual that circulated through the entire 20th century occult revival was ever the complete, safeguarded operation its own manuscript tradition originally intended it to be. That is a thread this archive is not finished pulling, and we will come back to it before the night is over.
We left the Abramelin story with a gap in the record, a set of protective instructions present in the fuller German manuscripts and missing entirely from the English edition that shaped the entire 20th century occult revival. That gap turns out to have a companion, one we glossed over 2 entries ago and need to close properly before we go further. Remember the Picatrix and the passage its own translators called the perfecting, the final operation described in some manuscript branches and quietly dropped from others, never fully reconstructed by any scholar who has gone looking. Here is the answer, as close as documentary evidence actually gets us to one. Manuscript historians who have cross-referenced the surviving Picatrix branches now believe that omission was not accidental. It was not decay, not a page lost to fire or damp.
It was scribal discretion, copyists working for royal or ecclesiastical patrons deciding that some procedures belonged only in the hands of a reader already vetted, already positioned, already trusted by the institution paying for the manuscript. The book was never fully open even to the people wealthy enough to own it. That discretion is not a medieval quirk. It is a pattern, and our third entry tonight is the clearest surviving proof of it, because this book was never written with a village audience in mind at all. It lives today in the Bavarian State Library in Munich, catalogued as manuscript CLM 849, and historians simply call it the Munich Manual. Composed in the 15th century, almost certainly in Latin by a cleric or a cleric-trained scribe, it is one of the most complete surviving handbooks of demonic magic from the entire medieval period.
And unlike almost every other grimoire we associate with witchcraft, this one was never aimed at a hedge healer or a village cunning woman working charms for sick livestock. Its scholarly reconstruction, most thoroughly undertaken by the historian Richard Kiekhaefer in his study Forbidden Rites, makes a compelling case that the manual was compiled for court magicians, literate clerics operating inside or alongside royal and noble households, men who moved through the same halls as bishops and princes, offering services those households were willing to pay for, even while officially condemning them. Picture the kind of man this manuscript actually served. Not a hooded figure in a cave, a cleric in ordinary clerical dress, welcome at the castle gate because the steward already knows his face. He is shown to a side chamber off the Great Hall, the kind of room used for counting rents or storing plate, and the door is barred from the inside before a single word of the rite begins.
A single candle, a basin of water set on the table because certain operations in this tradition call for a scrying surface, and a plain bowl does the job as well as anything finer. He works from a manuscript bound in unmarked leather, no title on the spine, because a book like this never traveled labeled as what it was. Outside the door, a page boy has been told to say the room is being used for private prayer. And technically, depending on which line of the conjuration is running at that moment, that is not even a lie. The Munich Manual borrows its grammar wholesale from the liturgy, the same crosses, the same divine names, spoken toward a different end. When the rite concludes,
The cleric burns the scrap of parchment he wrote the client's request on, extinguishes the candle, and walks back out into the hall as if he had done nothing more unusual than hear confession. Nobody in that castle would have called him a sorcerer to his face.
The word waiting for men like him when courts wanted to distance themselves later was always something softer. Advisor, confessor, physician of hidden things. Read the actual contents, and the audience becomes obvious immediately. There are rites for compelling illusions, banquets that appear real, castles conjured out of nothing to impress a rival, phantom armies summoned for a night to unsettle an enemy's scouts. There are divinatory operations for locating stolen property, for identifying a thief inside a household, for answering questions a nobleman could not risk asking openly. There are operations aimed at love and coercion, at winning favor with a patron, at compelling another person's will to bend toward the operator's client. And running through all of it is a consistent demonic hierarchy, spirits invoked by name, commanded through conjurations that borrow the grammar of Christian liturgy itself. The same crosses, the same invocations of divine names, turned outward and aimed at compelling rather than worshipping. This was not folk magic scratched into a farmer's almanac. This was a professional's toolkit, built for a client with a court, a treasury, and a rival. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, and I'm using that word carefully because the actual mechanism deserves it. A village coming woman caught with a charm for curing a sick cow faced, at worst, local suspicion and occasionally a formal accusation. The men who used manuals like this one operated inside the households of the people who wrote the laws. The same nobility that funded inquisitorial tribunals to prosecute peasant sorcery quietly employed literate clerics running rites out of manuscripts exactly like this one, for exactly the kind of political advantage that mattered to a court. The danger was never distributed evenly. It moved along the same lines as power always does, flowing toward whoever already held it, and away from whoever did not. That is the quiet, ugly thread connecting three entries now. The Picatrix moved freely through a royal court and only became a hanging offense once it reached a provincial apothecary. The Abramelin operation promised total protection and was practiced, unfinished and unprotected, by a wealthy heir with the resources to walk away from his own ritual mid-course and simply move on with his life. And the Munich Manual was compiled, from the very beginning, as a professional service for exactly the audience least likely to ever face consequences for using it. Forbidden across all three never meant equally dangerous to everyone who touched it. It meant dangerous to whoever the institution had already decided did not belong in the room. There is one more detail about the Munich Manual worth sitting with before we move on, because it is the kind of detail that does not show up in any summary of the text's contents. A conservator working the folio decades ago, cataloguing the manuscript under raking light to map its water damage, angled her lamp low across the page, the way conservators do when they want the surface texture of the ink to throw its own shadow. Beside a conjuration, the main scribe treated as entirely routine. Nothing flagged, nothing set apart with the small marginal crosses he used elsewhere to mark the rites he clearly considered more severe. A second hand had pressed a short line into the parchment. Different ink, different pressure. No signature, no date, no flourish connecting it to anything else on the page. She logged it in the conservation notes as an unidentified annotation and moved on to the next folio, because that is what the job requires. Nobody since has definitively resolved whose hand made that mark, or why the one page the original scribe considered unremarkable is the one page someone else apparently felt compelled to touch. We will come back to that margin before this recording ends,
because a name written by someone other than the author, next to a page the author considered ordinary, is exactly the kind of thread this whole archive is built to pull. 3 real books now sit behind us. 3 manuscripts you could, with the right academic permissions and the right archive appointment, actually hold in your hands. The Picatrix in a research library reading room, the Abramelin manuscript in Paris or Wolfenbüttel, the Munich manual under glass in Bavaria. Real ink, real vellum, real catalog numbers you could look up tonight if you wanted to.
Every fear we have walked through so far has been a fear about real paper, prosecuted by real courts, copied by real hands. And now the taxonomy breaks its own rule. And now the taxonomy breaks its own rule. Because everything I have told you tonight, I told you as history. A manuscript, a court, a translator, a scribe. What comes next was never any of those things, and that is exactly why it may be the most dangerous entry in this entire episode. Before we step into it, one debt to settle. We left the Abramelin thread hanging on a missing page, protective material present in the complete German manuscript tradition, absent from Mathers's 1898 English translation, the version Crowley carried into Boleskine House and abandoned mid-working. Decades later, the German scholar Georg Dehn tracked down a fuller manuscript source and published a new translation restoring what Mathers had left out. What was in it? Additional preparatory safeguards, instructions for consecrating the working space more completely, material the earlier French manuscript Mathers relied on simply did not contain because it was itself an incomplete copy. Crowley was not following a corrupted ritual. He was following an honest translation of a dishonestly partial source. And he walked away from it exactly as underprotected as that gap would predict. The mystery was never supernatural. It was a chain of manuscript transmission, each copy a little thinner than the one before it, until an ambitious young magician in Scotland inherited a book missing pieces nobody had told him were gone. Now, picture the aisle from the very start of this recording one more time. The chained shelves, the iron collars, the librarian's keyring going still at the one volume that never needed a chain at all. I told you it was never written.
I want you to actually sit with how strange that sentence is, because we are about to spend the next several minutes proving it to you in obsessive detail, and the proof will not make the book any less feared. If anything, it will make the fear harder to explain. In the year 1924, a struggling pulp writer in Providence, Rhode Island, published a short story called The Hound in a magazine called Weird Tales. Buried in its pages, almost as a throwaway flourish, he cited a source: the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul Alhazred. The writer was Howard Phillips Lovecraft. The book did not exist. The author did not exist. The Arabic title he gave it, Al-Azif, was his own invented phrase, built from a word he understood to describe the night sound of insects, which Arab folklore attributed to the howling of demons. Lovecraft built the entire citation from nothing for a single reason every pulp writer of his era understood instinctively. A fake source, cited with enough bibliographic confidence, makes fiction feel like a leak rather than an invention. He used the trick again and again across the next decade, building out Alhazred's biography in later stories. A mad poet of Yemen, dead in broad daylight, devoured, the story claims, by an invisible monster, while a crowd of witnesses watched and did nothing. Lovecraft even sketched a fake publication history for the book itself,
tracing invented Latin and Greek translations through invented medieval censors, an entire counterfeit paper trail complete with a note that most surviving copies had supposedly been destroyed by church authorities. He built Libri Catenati for a book that had never once existed to be chained. Here is where an ordinary literary device stopped behaving like one.
Lovecraft's fellow pulp writers, friends of his through magazine correspondence, started citing the Necronomicon in their own stories too, treating another author's invention as if it were shared public folklore. Readers, especially younger readers encountering the citations without the context of the wider correspondence circle, began writing to libraries and bookstores asking to see a copy. Lovecraft himself, visibly startled by how far the joke had traveled, wrote directly to correspondents insisting, in his own words, that the book was a coinage of my own, that no such text or author had ever existed. He said this plainly, repeatedly, in letters that survive and have been published. It did not matter. The fiction had already left the room he wrote it in. Sit with what that actually means, because it is the money shot of this entire episode. The most feared occult book in modern history was invented by a pulp horror writer, and technically never existed at all. No author, no original manuscript, no first copy anyone can point to. And yet real people built real rituals around it. Real publishing houses printed real editions claiming real authenticity. Real practitioners suffered real breakdowns, chasing something that was, from its very first sentence, a piece of fiction with a fake citation attached. The clearest proof of that arrived in 1977, when a small publishing house released a book called The Simon Necronomicon, presented not as fiction, but as an authentic grimoire, its introduction claiming a chain of transmission through a Greek Orthodox priest and a mysterious source called only the Simon, never definitively identified to this day. It borrowed nothing from Lovecraft's actual invented content, and instead built an entirely new system of Mesopotamian-flavored ritual magic, wrapped in Lovecraft's famous title, because the title alone was already worth more than any content underneath it. It is still in print. It still sells. Sincere seekers still purchase it today, believing, at least at the moment of purchase, that they are holding something ancient. And where there is sincere belief, there is always someone waiting to profit from it more dishonestly than a publishing house ever could. Somewhere in the last quarter century, in a private message thread that later surfaced in occult collector circles, a buyer reached out about a manuscript being offered as a genuine, historically authentic copy of the Necronomicon, hand-bound, artificially aged, accompanied by a fabricated provenance story convincing enough to survive a first round of questions. He wanted it badly enough and trusted the seller enough to send a serious sum of money before ever holding the object in his hands. What arrived was exactly what the entire history of this book should have told him to expect: a forgery. No author, no manuscript tradition, no chain of custody, because there has never been one to fake convincingly, only one to fake badly, and he had just paid for the badly. When the story became public within collector forums, the response was not sympathy. It was mockery, spread widely, his name and his mistake turned into a cautionary punchline. The seller, as far as any public record shows, faced no consequence at all. No refund, no accountability, no name attached to the fraud the way the buyer's name got attached to the humiliation. That asymmetry should sound familiar by now. It is the same one we watched in a Cuenca courtroom, the same one sitting quietly inside a Bavarian manuscript's court-only readership. Belief gets punished.
The machinery profiting from that belief almost never does. We are close to the center of this now, and I want to be honest with you about where the center actually sits. The Necronomicon is not dangerous because a demon might climb out of its pages. It is dangerous because it proves, more completely than any of our 3 real grimoires managed to prove, that a book's power was never about what was printed inside it at all. Let me be direct about what just happened, because it is the actual turn this entire episode has been building toward. A writer in Providence invented a book to make his fiction feel older than it was, and within 2 generations, working occultists had taken that invention and started performing rituals from it as though it were a genuine transmission from a real ancient source. Not despite knowing Lovecraft made it up, in some documented cases, while knowing exactly that, and treating the knowing as beside the point. The clearest and most influential case is a British occultist named Kenneth Grant. Grant trained directly under Aleister Crowley in the final years of Crowley's life, inherited a leadership claim within one branch of the magical order Crowley had led, and in 1973 founded his own organization, the Typhonian Order, built around a specific and genuinely startling argument. Grant proposed that Lovecraft's fiction was not simple invention at all. He argued that Lovecraft, without consciously intending to, had tapped into a real current of occult knowledge through his dreams and his unconscious. That entities like Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth were not literary creations, but garbled transmissions of genuine trans-dimensional intelligences arriving through a sensitive mind, whether that mind believed in them or not. He laid this argument out across a series of books published from the early 1970s onward, collectively known today as the Typhonian Trilogies, beginning with a volume called The Magical Revival in 1972. These were not obscure pamphlets. They were treated, within significant parts of the ceremonial magic community, as serious continuations of the Thelemic tradition Crowley had founded. Picture the room where a good portion of that first trilogy actually took shape. A cramped London flat, shelves sagging under decades of correspondence, a black and white photograph of Crowley propped on the mantel where another family might have kept a wedding portrait. Grant working late, a single desk lamp burning, his own annotated copy of Lovecraft's stories open, beside a stack of Crowley's unpublished diaries the older man had entrusted to him before he died. He is not performing anything a courtroom would recognize as a ritual in this moment. He is simply reading 2 unrelated texts side by side, a pulp horror story and a dead magician's private notebook, looking for the seam where they might connect. That is the entire method, stripped of theater. Close reading, treated as revelation, conducted alone at night by a man convinced that pattern recognition and prophecy were closer to the same skill than anyone else in his field was willing to admit. Nobody chained him to that desk. Nobody needed to. He built the discipline himself out of grief for a mentor and a private certainty that the fiction on his left hand and the magic on his right hand were, underneath their different covers, describing the same thing. Sit with the actual mechanics of what Grant did, because it is stranger than occultist believes in fiction. Grant never claimed Lovecraft's stories were literally true as written. His argument was more sophisticated and, honestly, more dangerous than that. That fiction can be a delivery mechanism for something real. That a story can carry an authentic current the way a radio carries a signal, regardless of whether the announcer understands the physics of the broadcast. Under that framework, the fact that Alhazred never existed stops being a problem. It becomes evidence. Of course, the official record shows no such author, Grant's framework would say.
The transmission was never supposed to look like a citation a librarian could verify. It was supposed to look exactly like fiction, because fiction is the disguise that gets certain kinds of knowledge past a skeptical mind's defenses. Here is what that actually means, stripped of the mystique. A community of serious, literate practitioners took a text explicitly built from nothing, ran real ceremonial procedure against its invented names and invented hierarchy, and reported real subjective results, visions, altered states, a felt sense of contact. None of that required the Necronomicon to be ancient. It required only that enough practitioners agree to treat it as though the question of ancient origin no longer mattered. Belief did the work that historical authenticity was supposed to do. The ritual worked, in whatever sense a ritual works, because enough minds performed it with total conviction, not because a 15th century Arab scholar once wrote down a real formula in a real desert somewhere. And here is where I need you to go back with me, one final time, to that dark aisle from the very beginning of this recording, because everything in it just inverted itself. A chained book, remember, was never dangerous because of the ink on its pages. It was dangerous because an institution had decided the reader touching it needed to be watched, controlled, kept inside a system someone else operated. The Picatrix, the Abramelin manuscript, the Munich Manual, all three earned their chains from courts, tribunals, and libraries that existed outside the reader, external structures asserting control over a real physical object. The Necronomicon never had an external institution to chain it, because it never had a physical original to chain in the first place. So the chain moved. It stopped sitting on the book. It moved inside the reader, onto their certainty, onto the private, unverifiable conviction that this fictional thing was, in some sense that mattered to them personally, real. That is a chain no librarian can see, no cathedral can bolt to a shelf, no tribunal record can document with a name and a sentence. It is also, if Grant's decades of published practice are any indication, a far more durable one than iron ever was.
This is not ancient history contained safely behind glass, either.
The exact same mechanism is running right now, updated for the internet. Open one of those anonymous marketplaces yourself, the kind indexed nowhere, reachable only if someone already sent you the link, and the pattern repeats itself with almost comic precision. A listing for a cursed PDF, price attached, seller history scrubbed. A reviews section full of buyers swearing the file changed something in their house the same week they opened it, alongside a smaller, quieter thread of buyers admitting they paid for a document they could have found, word for word, on a public archive site for nothing. The scarcity was never in the content.
It was manufactured in the listing itself. The private link, the countdown timer, the seller's insistence that only a limited number of buyers would ever be granted access before the file was sealed again. Watch that page for more than a few minutes, and you start to recognize the shape underneath the marketing. It is the same shape as an iron collar bolted through a spine. Auction houses, meanwhile, still move genuine antique grimoires and occult manuscripts for serious sums to private collectors, trading on precisely the same logic that got a Cuenca apothecary sentenced centuries ago. The conviction that scarcity itself is proof of power. A chain, a locked case, a verified rare listing, a cursed PDF storefront insisting the file is somehow more dangerous because it is hard to find. Different centuries, identical mechanism, dressed in whatever material happened to be available at the time. We are standing, right now, at the exact center of this archive. Every entry so far has been building toward one uncomfortable proposition.
and I think it is time to say it plainly instead of circling it any longer. If a fictional book, invented by one lonely writer with no ritual tradition behind him at all, can generate real ceremonial orders, real published trilogies, real subjective spiritual experience reported by serious practitioners across half a century, then the entire premise this episode opened with was backwards from the start. We've been asking what makes a book dangerous enough to forbid. That was never the real question. The real question is what a reader's certainty is capable of building once no institution is left standing between that certainty and the world. Every entry in this archive has been circling the same conclusion from a different angle, and I want to state it now without any more scaffolding around it, because it is the actual structural lesson this whole taxonomy was built to teach. Across all three tiers we have opened tonight, astral magic, demonic evocation, and the myth books believed real, Forbidden never once tracked the content sitting inside the covers. It tracked who controlled access to that content, and how tightly. Walk the proof backward with me. The Picatrix contained a working system of planetary correspondence, openly commissioned by a king, freely available to anyone with royal favor, and became a capital offense the moment it reached a provincial apothecary outside that circle of favor. The Abramelin manuscript contained an explicit internal warning against incomplete practice, was translated honestly by a serious scholar working from an honestly incomplete source, and became dangerous specifically because the institutional chain of transmission had quietly thinned itself before Crowley ever opened the cover. The Munich manual contained material objectively more aggressive than anything in the other two texts: coercion, illusion, compulsion, and drew no prosecution at all for the class of reader it was actually written for, because that reader sat inside the institution rather than outside it. Access, not ink, every single time. And then the Necronomicon walked in and made the proof airtight, because the Necronomicon is the one entry in this entire episode with no content to control in the first place. No manuscript, no author, no original text any institution could have chained, even if it wanted to. And it still generated fear, still generated real ceremonial orders, still generated a real published trilogy from a serious occultist treating fiction as revelation. If forbidden status required dangerous content, the Necronomicon should be the safest book in this entire recording. Nothing is written down that could hurt anyone. It is instead the one that spread the furthest, precisely because the control moved off the page entirely and onto belief, where no lock, no chain, and no tribunal has ever been able to reach it. Here is what that really means once you strip away the candlelight. Every fear we have walked through tonight was, underneath the ritual language, a fear about who gets to gatekeep a resource, physical, spiritual, informational, and what they are willing to do to whoever tries to reach it without permission. And here is the genuinely bleak part, the part I don't think enough people watching content like this ever sit with long enough. That mechanism was never unique to magic. It is just easiest to see clearly inside magic, because magic dresses the gatekeeping up in robes and Latin instead of hiding it inside a terms of service agreement. But before we go further into where that mechanism lives today, I want to give you something else. Because everything I have described so far in this episode is a story about people who exploited access, or feared access, or punished access unevenly. There is another kind of person running underneath this whole history, quieter, slower, and almost never the subject of a documentary because nothing about the work makes good footage. Picture a reading room in a research library, years of a working life spent at the same desk, The kind of desk where the wood has taken on a permanent groove from a forearm resting there every day. The scholar I'm describing is Georg Dehn, the researcher who tracked down the fuller German manuscript tradition of the Abramelin text we opened earlier in this episode, cross-referenced it against the incomplete French copy Mathers had relied on a century earlier, and spent years producing a translation honest enough to finally show readers exactly what had been missing from the version that shaped an entire century of occult practice.
That is not glamorous work. It does not summon anything. It does not promise a reader power, contact, or transformation. It is patient, philological labor, comparing hand after hand, dialect after dialect, discrepancy after discrepancy, undertaken specifically so that the next Aleister Crowley, whoever and whenever he turns out to be, has an honest and complete text instead of an accidentally gutted one. The same tradition of careful, unglamorous restoration produced the modern critical edition of the Picatrix itself, painstaking Latin and Arabic textual scholarship undertaken at institutions like the Warburg Institute in London, work that exists for no reason except to make sure a real historical document is understood accurately rather than mythologized into something it never was. That is the quiet, unglamorous opposite of everything else we have discussed tonight. Not gatekeeping, not manufactured scarcity. The deliberate, painstaking act of making a real and once dangerous text fully, honestly, accurately available, footnoted, contextualized, stripped of exactly the kind of mystique that gets people hurt. People like that will never trend. Their names will never headline a thumbnail. And the entire reason any of us can discuss these 3 real manuscripts with any accuracy at all tonight is because someone spent years of an unglamorous life making sure the record was honest instead of profitable. Hold on to that, because it is the clearest countermodel to everything else in this episode, and it is worth remembering the next time you feel the pull of the other kind of gatekeeping. Because that pull is not going anywhere, and it did not stay behind in the medieval period. Look at where manufactured scarcity actually lives now, outside any occult context whatsoever, and the shape is identical to everything we have traced tonight. Limited product drops, deliberately undersupplied against known demand, sold not for their material cost, but for the manufactured urgency of missing out. Gated insider information, entire paid tiers of newsletters and private chat groups promising access to knowledge the free version supposedly cannot give you, the actual content often thin, the value almost entirely constructed from the exclusivity of the door itself. Even inside legitimate expertise, the same instinct shows up. The credentialed voice implying that real understanding requires initiation, that the public version of an explanation is necessarily the watered-down one. None of these modern systems chain a physical book to a lectern. They do not need to. They have simply relocated the chain to exactly the place the Necronomicon already proved was more effective than iron ever was. Onto the reader's own certainty that what sits behind the paywall, the velvet rope, or the private forum must be worth more than what is standing in plain sight. That is the system this entire archive has been mapping, one chained shelf at a time. And now that you can see it clearly, there is one last piece left to walk through. The part of this that is not really about medieval history at all, and the part I think you came here for, even if you did not know it yet. We opened this recording in a dark aisle, walking past shelf after shelf of chained books, and I told you there was one volume sitting there with no chain at all. You know now exactly why. It never needed one, because the thing that was actually being restrained was never paper. It was certainty.
Every institution in this episode, a Castilian court, a Cuenca tribunal, a Bavarian scriptorium, a British occult order, a modern marketplace selling PDFs by candlelight flavored marketing copy, was managing the exact same resource, not knowledge, belief. And belief, unlike a manuscript, cannot be bolted to a lectern. Before we leave the Munich Manual behind for good, one thread deserves its honest ending rather than a dramatic one. That unidentified name in the margin, sitting beside a page the original scribe never flagged as special. The most credible explanation, offered by later conservators working the folio, is disappointingly ordinary. Manuscripts like this one passed through private hands for generations before any library cataloged them. And a later owner marking a page with initials or a private note, unrelated to the rite itself, was common practice, not a message from anything beyond the room. Picture, for a moment, the kind of hand that most likely made that mark.
Not a sorcerer, a collector, 3 or 4 owners removed from the original court cleric, living in a modest house with a small private shelf of curiosities he never fully understood the value of. He has acquired the manuscript the way such things changed hands quietly for centuries, through an estate sale, a debt settled in books instead of coin, a relative's belongings sorted after a death. He sits at a plain table with a single candle, running his thumb along a page whose Latin he can only partly read, and beside a passage that means nothing special to him, he writes his own initials, the way a man marks the inside cover of any book he owns, an ordinary habit of ownership repeated across 1,000 other unremarkable volumes in 1,000 other unremarkable houses. He has no idea a demonic conjuration sits 2 lines above his signature. He is thinking about supper, or the weather, or the debt that brought the book into his hands in the first place. That is the whole scene. No ritual, no threat, no design. Just a bored, ordinary evening centuries ago, leaving behind a mark that would outlast his name. The mystery was never a haunting. It was provenance, imperfectly recorded, the way most ordinary objects lose their history in exactly this quiet, unremarkable way. Not every gap in the record is a door. Some of them are just gaps. That is not a disappointing answer. It is, I think, the most honest one this entire archive has to offer. And it closes the deeper loop underneath everything we have walked through tonight. I told you, standing in that aisle, to hold on to one idea until it fit every door we opened. A chained book is not a book that cannot be read. It is a book that can only be read inside a system someone else controls. We have now watched that system operate 4 completely different ways. Through royal favor, through incomplete translation, through professional class privilege, and finally, through no physical object at all.
The chain was never the mechanism. The chain was only ever the visible proof that somebody, somewhere, had already decided your certainty was worth controlling. Take away the iron, take away the manuscript, take away even the author, and the mechanism runs exactly the same, because the actual hinge it turns on was sitting inside the reader the entire time. I want to be careful about what I am and am not telling you to do with that, because this channel does not deal in salvation, and it is not about to start now. I am not telling you these 3 real manuscripts are safe to practice from casually, and I am not telling you the Necronomicon current Kenneth Grant spent decades building is nonsense to be dismissed with a laugh. Serious people have found serious meaning in all of it across centuries,
and that meaning was real to them, whether or not I personally share it. What I am telling you is narrower, and I think it matters more than a warning ever could.
The pattern itself, manufactured scarcity dressed as danger, access controlled and mistaken for content controlled,
is not a secret once you know to look for it. Behavioral researchers like Dan Ariely have spent entire careers documenting how artificially limited access reliably makes people value a thing more than its actual qualities justify, completely independent of any occult framing at all. That is not a medieval superstition. That is a measurable feature of how human attention works, and it is being used on you constantly, in contexts that have nothing to do with grimoires or demons. Watch the pattern show up the next time it happens to you, because it will, probably sooner than you expect. A late-night scroll, a listing promising something limited, private, almost gone. A countdown timer ticking down in the corner of the screen. A message that only a small number of people will ever see this before the page disappears.
Somewhere in that moment, if tonight actually landed, a small flat second of recognition arrives before the impulse does. That's the chain, dressed in a font instead of iron. You can close the tab. You can also just notice it, name it, and choose anyway with open eyes instead of borrowed urgency. Either one counts as the awareness this whole episode was actually about. Seeing that pattern clearly, in a 15th century courtroom or in tonight's private marketplace listing, is not protection. It is not a spell against exploitation. It is only awareness. But awareness is the one thing every single person we discussed tonight, the apothecary, the abandoned ritual at Boleskine, the buyer mocked for a forged manuscript, did not have in the moment they needed it most. If this changed even slightly how you hear the word forbidden the next time someone uses it to sell you something, that is worth marking. The plain, unglamorous version of that is a like on this video and a subscription to this channel. And I am asking for exactly that, calmly, once, because the next descent into this archive deserves to find you already here, rather than scrolling past it by accident. Picture the aisle one final time. The librarian's keyring has gone quiet again. The chained volumes sit exactly where they have sat for centuries, iron collars catching the last of the light before she locks the door behind her. And the one hook near the end of the row, the one that never held a chain at all, sits empty the way it always has. Not because nothing was ever there, but because the thing it was guarding was never small enough to hang from iron in the first place. The safest book in this archive is the one you never let yourself fully believe. Next time, we open a different kind of forbidden entirely. The archive of books collectors were paid to destroy, and the ones that vanished from every library on purpose. Keep your eyes open. Keep your certainty honest.